A foot whipped through the air and stopped 1 inch from a man's jaw. The man didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stood there while the leg hung in the air, pointed at his face. Then the leg dropped, and the still man smiled. Across the mat, dozens of black belts had stopped breathing. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. They had just watched something they couldn't explain. One man had moved faster than the human I should move. The other had read every inch of it and held his ground. The fast one was Bruce Lee. The still one was Chuck Norris. What happened in the next 10 minutes went so far past the public story that no man in that room ever spoke of it again. What did Bruce Lee do that made Chuck Norris stay quiet for the rest of his life? Stay with me on this one. Now this story really begins on a hot August afternoon in 1967. The Long Beach International Karate Championships were the biggest gathering of fighters in the country. Every major name in American martial arts was there. Champions, grandmasters, black belts from every system you could think of. Korean, Japanese, Chinese, American. It didn't matter. If you trained hard and fought hard, you came to Long Beach. Chuck Norris was 27 years old. He had just won the World Middleweight Karate Championship the year before, and he was still riding that wave. He had a flat, blunt face and the kind of shoulders you build from years of hauling around your own body weight on military bases. Air Force, Korea. He had learned Tang Soo Do from a Korean master in a barracks gym, and he had been winning tournaments ever since. Nobody had beaten him on the championship floor. Nobody. But Chuck wasn't there to fight that day. He was a guest, a celebrity really in that small world. He was there to demonstrate, to shake hands, to sign autographs, to watch the new generation move. And then he saw the man on the demonstration mat. The man was small, maybe 5'7", maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. He had long hair, a Chinese face, and a body that looked carved out of dark wood. Every muscle on his arms stood out like rope under skin. He moved differently. He didn't move the way a karate man moves. He didn't have those locked stances. He didn't snap his strikes the way Chuck had been trained to. He flowed. That's the only word for it. He flowed. Chuck watched the man do a punch. Just one punch. From 1 inch away from a wooden board. The board cracked clean in half. Chuck had seen guys break boards before. He had broken hundreds of them himself. But not like that. Not from 1 inch. That kind of power required something Chuck didn't understand yet. Something in the hips. Something in the breath. Something deeper than muscle. Then the man dropped to the floor and did push-ups on 2 fingers. Just 2. The thumb and the index finger. Of one hand. Chuck stopped chewing his gum. The man stood up, brushed off his pants, and smiled at the crowd. The crowd went silent. Then they exploded into applause. Chuck didn't clap. He was still trying to understand what he had just watched. A man standing next to Chuck leaned over and said the small man's name in his ear. Bruce Lee. Chuck had heard the name. Everybody had heard the name by then. Lee was a Hong Kong actor who had been on an American TV show called The Green Hornet. He played a chauffeur named Kato who beat up bad guys. The fight scenes had caused a small earthquake in the martial arts community. Real fighters watched them and asked each other, "Who is this guy?" Now Chuck was watching him, and he understood, finally, why the rumor mill had been spinning for 2 years. Bruce stepped off the mat. The crowd parted. Bruce moved through them without bumping a single shoulder, and he walked, of all places, straight up to Chuck Norris. He held out his hand. Chuck took it. The grip was small but exact. The way a fighter notices another fighter's hand. You can tell everything from a handshake. The calluses, the bone density, the temperature. Bruce's hand was hot, like a man whose engine never quite shuts off. "I've heard about you," Bruce said. "I've heard about you too," Chuck said. They stood there a moment. 2 men with very different bodies and very different reputations, standing in the middle of a tournament floor, sizing each other up the way only fighters can size each other up. The way that doesn't show on the outside but happens completely on the inside. Then Bruce smiled. Maybe we should talk. Privately. Sometime soon. Chuck nodded once. That was it. That was the meeting. 20 seconds. A handshake. A few words. And a private agreement between two of the most dangerous men in their world to find out exactly what the other one had. Believe me, that kind of meeting doesn't happen by accident. When Bruce Lee said privately, he didn't mean coffee. He meant a closed room. He meant no cameras. He meant gloves off. Chuck Norris went home that night holding his championship belt in his hand. He looked at it for a long time, because he knew, sitting on the edge of his bed, that everything he had built that belt to prove was about to be tested by a man who weighed 30 pounds less than him. And he didn't sleep much. The phone call came 2 weeks later. Bruce had a small school he ran in the back of a building in Los Angeles. He invited Chuck out, just to move around a little. Those were his exact words on the phone. Move around a little. Chuck knew what those words meant. He drove out one Sunday morning. The school was nothing fancy. A wooden floor. A few hanging bags. A Wing Chun dummy in the corner with deep scuff marks all over the wooden arms. The walls were painted white. The windows were small. Bruce wanted privacy and he had it. Bruce greeted him in a black shirt and white pants. No belt. No ranking. Bruce didn't believe in belts anymore. He thought they got in the way of real fighting. He had a saying about it. He used to tell people, a belt is good for holding up your pants. The two men stood across from each other on the wooden floor. There was no judge, no referee, no camera, no witness at all except for one of Bruce's students sitting quietly against the back wall with a stopwatch he never started. Light, Bruce said. Just play. Chuck nodded. They bowed. And then Bruce was already moving. Chuck had been a competitive fighter for almost a decade by then. He had faced everybody. Big guys. Fast guys. Mean guys. Guys who tried to take his head off in the first 10 seconds. He had a mental clock for what fast was. Fast was a man who could close 5 feet in less than a second. Fast was a man whose hands moved before you could see them set up. Bruce didn't move like a fast man. Bruce moved like a man who already knew where Chuck's body was going to be. He didn't seem to strike. He just appeared. Where there had been empty space a moment before, suddenly there was a fist, or an elbow, or a foot. Chuck threw a hard front kick. Bruce wasn't there. Chuck threw a hook. Bruce was already inside it. Chuck threw a knee. Bruce had already turned a quarter of the way around and Chuck's knee passed through air. This kept happening. Bruce never struck back at first. He just slipped. He just touched Chuck on the shoulder, on the ear, on the side of the neck. Little soft taps. A boxer would call them measure shots. A martial artist would call them the kindest thing a man can do. He was saying, I could hit you here. I could hit you here. I could hit you here. Chuck didn't get angry. He got curious. Then he got serious. Then he got something he didn't recognize. A feeling he hadn't had since he was a white belt in Korea. The feeling of not knowing what was coming next. He took a step back. Bruce, he said. Hit me. Stop pulling them. Hit me. Bruce smiled. The next 30 seconds changed everything Chuck thought he knew about combat. Bruce slipped in. His hand snapped out like a whip. Chuck felt the air move past his cheek. Felt the weight of the punch as it passed. He had never felt a punch that close that didn't actually land. The control was inhuman. A man who could pull a punch at that speed had a level of awareness Chuck had only read about in old books. Chuck planted his feet and threw the kick that had won him the world title. The one nobody had ever blocked clean. A spinning back kick. Heel first. 200 pounds of farm-bred American man behind it. Bruce caught the foot in his armpit. Not a deflection. Not a block. He caught it. He stepped inside the rotation and tucked Chuck's foot under his arm. And Chuck was suddenly standing on one leg, balanced on a man who weighed less than his own torso did. Bruce held him there for 1 second, just to make a point. Then he set Chuck's foot down on the floor and stepped back. "You have good hips," Bruce said quietly. "Most karate men don't." Chuck didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth was dry. They went again. And this is where the story gets harder to tell. Because Chuck started adjusting. That's the thing nobody talks about with Chuck Norris. People think he was just tough. People think he just out-muscled his way through tournaments. But Chuck was a thinker. He watched. He adapted in real time. And he started to figure something out about Bruce. Bruce was lightning. But lightning has to come down somewhere. The next time Bruce slipped in, Chuck didn't try to hit him. He didn't try to defend. He simply moved his body where he had calculated Bruce's body would land. And Bruce, for the first time, ran into something instead of air. Chuck's shoulder hit Bruce square in the chest. Bruce went a step backward. The whole room shifted. The student against the wall sat up. Even Bruce's eyes changed, just a flicker, just for a moment. Not anger, not surprise, something else, something more like recognition. They squared up again. And now the sparring stopped feeling like sparring. It became something else. Faster, harder, closer. Bruce wasn't holding back the speed anymore. Chuck wasn't holding back the power. Strikes landed. Real ones. Not full bore. They were both too professional for that. But real enough to bruise. Real enough to break a rib in the wrong place. Real enough that an outside observer would have called it a fight. They went for what felt like a long time. It was probably 3 minutes. To them it felt like an hour. Their breath came hard. Their shirts were dark with sweat. Chuck's lip had a thin line of blood on it. Bruce had a red welt on the side of his ribs. Then Bruce held up his hand. "Stop!" They both stopped. Bruce was breathing hard but smiling. A real smile. Not the showman's smile. Not the demonstration smile. The smile a man gives when he has found something he has been looking for. "Good," Bruce said. "Good, Chuck. Very good." Chuck nodded. His chest was heaving. His shirt was soaked. The pulse in his neck was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Bruce walked over to a small wooden bench and picked up a white towel. He tossed it across the room. Chuck caught it. He wiped his face. He felt the cool of the cotton on his skin and let out a long, slow breath. It was over. That's what Chuck thought. He took 2 steps to the bench, sat down, picked up a paper cup of water that one of Bruce's students had set out earlier. He drank it slowly. He watched the dust float in the light from the small window. His heart rate started coming down. His hands stopped shaking. He had survived sparring with Bruce Lee. He had even held his own. He had given as good as he had received. Or so he thought. Then Bruce said something. Quiet. Almost gentle. Again Chuck. But this time. Real. The cup stopped halfway to Chuck's mouth. He looked up. Bruce was standing in the middle of the floor. Not smiling anymore. Not relaxed. His weight had dropped down into his feet. His hands hung loose. His eyes were on Chuck the way a hawk's eyes lock onto a rabbit in a field 200 yards away. Chuck set the cup down. Slowly. "What do you mean?" "Real. What you saw before was a test. Now we move. Without pulling." Chuck didn't understand for a second. Then he understood completely. Everything that had just happened. Every strike. Every slip. Every catch. The kick under the arm. The shoulder against the chest. All of it. Bruce had been measuring him. Bruce had been testing him. Like a craftsman tests the wood before he cuts it. Bruce hadn't shown him anything real yet. He had been seeing what Chuck had. What he could survive. What he could absorb. What he understood. And Chuck had passed. Chuck had passed enough that now Bruce wanted the next door opened. Here's the thing nobody tells you about men at that level. There aren't many of them. Maybe 100 in the whole world at any given time. Real masters. Men who have moved past technique and into something else. And when those men meet each other in private, when the cameras are off, when the trophies don't matter, they want to know one thing. What does this man really have? Not what does he show. Not what does he teach. What does he have? Down at the bottom. Down where the lights don't reach. Bruce wanted to know what Chuck Norris had at the bottom. And the only way to find out was to take everything off. Chuck stood up. He walked to the center of the floor. His legs felt heavier than they had 10 minutes earlier. Not from tiredness. From something else. From the weight of what he was about to do. He looked at Bruce. He measured him. The narrow shoulders. The slim hips. The compact frame. By every standard Chuck had been taught for 10 years, he should have been able to crush a man this size. 28 pounds heavier. 5 inches taller. Years of full-contact tournament experience against grown men who tried to break him for fun. But that math didn't work on Bruce. Bruce broke the math. "All right," Chuck said. They bowed again. This bow was different from the first one. The first one had been polite. This one was a kind of promise. A promise that nobody in this room would be pretending anymore. They came together. What happened in the next 2 minutes nobody would describe in detail for years. Bruce never wrote about it. Chuck only ever spoke about it in fragments. Pieces. Half a sentence here. A look there. He told one friend that the second round felt like fighting something that wasn't entirely a man. He told another that he had never felt fear like that before or since. Not even in combat. But here is what we know. Bruce came in low. Not the showy stance from the demonstration. A different one. A street fighter's stance. Hands at chin level. Lead foot pointed forward. Hips coiled tight. He intercepted. Bruce had been working on something he called the intercepting fist. The idea was simple. Don't block your opponent's attack. Don't dodge it. Intercept it. Strike at the same time he strikes, in the middle of his motion, when his body is committed and can't change direction. It was the heart of what he would later call Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. Chuck threw the first punch in the second round. A straight cross. Solid. Fast for a heavyweight. Bruce's fist passed through Chuck's guard. Hit him in the sternum. And Chuck felt every drop of air leave his lungs in one short cough. He stumbled. He didn't go down. But he stumbled. Now look. If you're with me on this story, and you want more of these legendary face-offs that the big history books don't tell you straight, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear next is the part that even Chuck's closest friends say he never described in full. Chuck recovered. He came back in. He had to. He had no choice. To back away now was to lose forever. Not in any record book. Nobody was keeping score. To back away was to lose to himself. And Chuck Norris had built his whole life on never losing to himself. He swung harder. He kicked higher. He moved closer. He broke into Bruce's rhythm. And here is what saved him. Chuck had something Bruce didn't have. Bruce was faster. Bruce was more inventive. Bruce had better instincts. But Chuck could take a punch in a way few men on this earth could take a punch. Chuck Norris's body was a fortress. When Bruce's strikes started landing in the second round, they landed on a man who had been hit thousands of times by other strong men. A man whose ribs had been bruised so often they had stopped feeling new bruises. A man who could take 3 clean hits and still come forward. That was what Bruce was looking for. That was the answer to the question Bruce had been asking. What does Chuck Norris really have? The answer wasn't speed. It wasn't technique. It wasn't strategy. It was something deeper. Chuck could not be hurt fast enough to be stopped. Bruce realized this in the middle of the second exchange. And his smile changed. The next 60 seconds were what made the whole thing legendary in private circles. Bruce hit Chuck 3 times. Chest. Jaw. Side of the head. Not full force. But not pulled either. Real punches that any normal man would have crumpled under. Chuck took them. He absorbed them. He turned his head with the last one to take the sting out, exactly the way old boxers used to teach. And he kept coming. Chuck got inside. That was the moment. You have to understand something about Bruce Lee to understand why this mattered. Bruce had built his entire system around not letting people get inside his range. His footwork was his shield. He moved better than anyone Chuck had ever seen move. The whole point was to control the distance, to stay just barely out of reach so that he could land and his opponent couldn't. But Chuck wasn't trying to land anymore. Chuck was trying to close. He came in like a tank, shoulder lowered, lead foot driving. He absorbed 2 more strikes on the way in. Bruce hit him in the temple. Chuck blinked. He kept moving. Bruce shifted to one side. Chuck shifted with him. Bruce went the other way. Chuck went with him. And then Chuck's right hand came up. Not a punch. A grab. Chuck's huge hand closed around the front of Bruce's shirt. Bruce tried to slip. Chuck had him. He drove forward. 3 hard steps. And he pinned Bruce Lee against the white wall of the school with a thud that rattled the small window in its frame. Bruce's feet came off the ground for just a second. The student against the back wall stood up. Chuck held Bruce there, not in anger, in something else. He looked into Bruce's face from 6 inches away. Bruce's eyes were wide, not afraid, alive as eyes get. For a moment nothing happened. Then Bruce laughed. It was the strangest sound. A short, sharp laugh, almost a bark. Like a man who had just been told a wonderful joke at exactly the wrong moment. "Set me down, Chuck." Chuck set him down. Bruce dusted off his shirt. He took a step back. He shook his arms out the way a man shakes out cold rain. He rolled his neck. And he looked at Chuck Norris with an expression Chuck would remember for the rest of his life. "Now," Bruce said quietly. "Now we both know." Chuck didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He understood. The whole thing had been a question. From the moment they met at the tournament. From the handshake. From the phone call. From the first bow. From the test round. From the catch under the arm. From the shoulder hit. From the cool towel. From the cup of water. All of it had been one long, slow question that Bruce was asking. That Chuck didn't even know he was answering until that final pin against the wall. The question was, "Are you real?" And the answer was, yes. Yes, Chuck Norris was real. He was not just a champion. He was not just a winner of trophies. He had something underneath all that. Something Bruce respected. Something Bruce could see now with his own eyes. Something Bruce had not been sure existed in any American fighter alive. And Chuck, for his part, now knew something about Bruce that the public would never see in a movie. Bruce Lee on film was a god. Bruce Lee in person in that white-walled school in Los Angeles was something else. He was a real human being, with real limits. A man who could be pinned against a wall. A man who could be reached. A man who could be measured the way fighters measure each other. He was not a god. He was the best fighter Chuck Norris had ever met. But he was a man. That knowledge, that single piece of knowledge, was worth more to Chuck Norris than any belt he had ever won. They stood there, both breathing hard, sweat on their faces. The white wall had a dark smudge on it where Chuck had pinned Bruce. A handprint. 2 handprints, really. Bruce's shoulders had left a mark, and Chuck's right hand had left a mark. Bruce looked at the wall and laughed again. "We should leave that there," he said. "For who?" Chuck said. "For us." They stood there a minute. Then Bruce walked over and offered his hand. Chuck took it. The grip was the same as the first time they had met. Small, hot, exact. But something had changed in it. The grip now had weight. It had history. It had a shared secret that neither man was ever going to tell. "Brother," Bruce said. "Brother," Chuck said back. And that was the savage part. That was the part that shocked everyone who ever heard about it. Not that the 2 men had hurt each other. Not that one had won or lost. The savage part, the part that the polished story never told you, was that they had gone all the way down. They had stripped off every piece of pretense. They had hit and been hit. They had pinned and been pinned. They had not held back. And out of all that rawness, Out of all that 10 minutes of pure no-quarter contact came something that not many fighters in the world ever get to have. A brother. A brother they had earned the hard way. Chuck Norris had walked into that school as the world champion. He walked out as something different. Not bigger. Not smaller. Different. He walked out as a man who knew, for certain, what was at the bottom of him. He had hit it. He had touched it. He had used it. And the man who had pulled it out of him was walking him to the door with a towel around his neck. That afternoon stayed inside Chuck Norris for the rest of his life. He kept it there. He never told the full story. Not in interviews. Not in his autobiography. Not even to his own children when they were old enough to ask. He told pieces. He talked about Bruce's speed. He talked about Bruce's character. He talked about how Bruce had made him a better fighter just by existing. But he never described what happened on that wooden floor with full honesty. He never told anyone about the second round. He never told anyone about the wall. And here is why. It wasn't shame. Chuck Norris was not a man who carried shame about a fight. He had been hit before. He had hit other men before. A few bruises and a sore rib were nothing to him. It wasn't fear. He wasn't afraid of how it would look. He wasn't afraid of his reputation. He was already a champion. He didn't need to protect anything. The reason Chuck Norris stayed quiet for life was simpler than people guessed. It was sacred. The word he used in private when an old friend asked him directly years later was sacred. He said it the way some men say a prayer. He said that some moments between two fighters are sacred and putting them into words is the same as taking them away. Some things only have weight if you carry them quietly. So he carried it quietly. For the rest of that summer, Chuck and Bruce trained together. 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes at Bruce's school. Sometimes at Chuck's. They taught each other. Bruce gave Chuck speed. Chuck gave Bruce power. They became close. Their families became close. Bruce came to dinner at the Norris house. Their kids played together. They argued about technique. They argued about diet. They argued about everything two strong-headed men argue about. But they never had another sparring session like the first one. They didn't need to. A few years later, Bruce called Chuck with an idea. A movie. Bruce was making something special in Rome. He wanted Chuck in it. Not as a side character. As the final opponent. The big fight at the end. A scene in the Colosseum. Bruce wanted the most famous symbol of ancient combat to be the backdrop for a fight between two men who actually knew how to fight. Chuck said yes before Bruce finished asking. They flew to Rome. They choreographed the fight together. They drew on what they knew about each other. The angles, the weights, the rhythms, the way Bruce moved fast and Chuck moved heavy. They put the soul of their private encounter into the public film. And anyone who has ever watched that scene closely, anyone who pays attention, can see something in the way the two men look at each other between strikes. A look that wasn't acting. A look you can only have between two men who have been all the way down with each other and come back up. That movie, Way of the Dragon, became one of the most iconic martial arts films ever made. And the Colosseum fight became the most copied fight scene in cinema history. But the real fight happened years before, in a small school, with white walls, and a handprint that probably got painted over by some new tenant a long time ago. Now here is the hardest part to say. Bruce Lee died in 1973. He was 32 years old. The world stopped that day. Chuck Norris flew to Hong Kong for the funeral. He carried the casket with Steve McQueen and James Coburn and a few other men who had loved Bruce. Chuck didn't say much at the funeral. He didn't say much at the press events afterward. He went home to his family. He kept training. He kept making movies. He went on to become the biggest action star in American television. He built a school. He raised his children. He grew old. But every once in a while he would go quiet. And the people closest to him knew not to ask. They knew he was thinking about Bruce. About the school. About the wall. about the brother he had made the hard way and lost too soon. Many years later, Chuck visited Bruce's grave in Seattle. He stood in front of the headstone in the quiet rain. He didn't pray out loud. He didn't speak. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the rain fall on the words. And in that moment, an old memory came up. He remembered standing in a white room with his hands at his sides, while a small man's foot hung 1 inch from his jaw. He remembered the silence. He remembered the way the foot dropped. He remembered Bruce's smile, the first smile, before any of it had really started. And he remembered why he had never been afraid that day. It was because somewhere inside himself he had already known. He had known he was about to meet the only man on earth who could ever push him to the bottom of himself. And he had known, even before they began, that he was going to thank him for it, for the rest of his life. A fighter spends his whole career looking for the one opponent who can show him what he is. Most fighters never find that opponent. They retire still wondering. They die still wondering. Chuck Norris was not one of those fighters. He had found his man, and he had carried the secret of what passed between them, quietly, sacredly, with the full weight of 2 strong men who once stood in a small white room, and went all the way down, and found a brother on the way back up.